welcome to the second part of my conversation with Laura Colombino and Yugin on Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. In this part, we discuss the roles of memory and philosophy in the novel and consider the way that it comments on contemporary politics in Britain. If you didn't catch the first part, I do suggest you check that out first. And if you're enjoying our conversation, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Welcome to the second part of my discussion with Yugin and Laura Colombino on Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. If you didn't catch part one, I do suggest checking that out first. So in this section, I'll ask you both a little bit about your particular areas of interest with respect to Ishiguro's work. So Yugin, your book was called Kazuo Ishiguro and Memory. And in that book, you wrote about the importance of affirming shared memories for the characters. So I wanted to ask, I've got a question that's kind of complex and has a number of layers here. Can we think about memory and specifically shared memory on a number of levels? So yes, within the book and for the characters, but also how does the prevalence of memory in the book make certain kind of appeals to the reader? And to add another dimension to the question, now that some of us have been reading and rereading this book for 20 years, how does the memory of those earlier readings and maybe conversations we've had about the book, how do those things also affect the way we read the novel now? Hope that wasn't too much to cram into one question.
No, I've made some mental notes, but if I miss anything, do let me know, and feel free to interject. Yeah, so I think it's kind of you to mention my book. It feels a while now, but in Kazuo Ishiguro and Memory, I tried to I think I created a kind of a framework that looked at the philosophical memory work that was in his novels. And one of the things I thought Never Let Me Go did that was unique was this idea about affirmation that you talked about and shared memory. So this idea that while they were, I think I was quite moved by the way that while the clones in general were being ignored by society, they found ways to find each other, particularly those who had the shared experience of coming from, a posh environment like a posh school in Hailsham. And bear in mind, Ishiguro wanted to write a schools novel anyway to begin with. So you've got this collective experience of the alumni from the schools, but also it's a very disturbing kind of alumni to be a part of, because eventually you're going to be killed, you're going to be murdered for your organs. But nevertheless, it does bind them together, and so these shared memories exist and are mediated by really strange, almost surreal. And there's always something about Ishiguro's writing that is quite surreal and speculative and fantastical. So it doesn't always have to be, it could be in the more realist novels when this happens, but they are dreamlike episodes in the novel. I'm thinking of Kathy's dreams of walking behind a clown, holding balloons and with faces on, imagining if the strings were cut and the balloons fly away, they lose that tie to Hailsham. And this is following on from the news that Hailsham had closed, or was closing, I think had closed. And as she heard this from meeting Laura, at the petrol station, when they were carers and having to refill the petrol in the cars, and she bumped into her and talked about their lives as carers and how, but they found themselves reminiscing about Hailsham. So this is what keeps them going. This is giving them the kind of life energy. And that's when she hears about Hailsham closing. And then later on, when the three friends go and looked at the beached kind of old boats by the water, and I think Ruth talked, and they were talking about Hailsham. And again, Ruth talked about her dream. So another surreal moment about Hailsham being flooded
Mm.
and her looking out the window and seeing all the detritus or the waste floating by, but somehow not panicking that there was a flood, but feeling quite tranquil about it. It's almost this tranquility that comes when you see the end. So again, very moving, but also very dreamlike. And a lot of this kind of goes back to dream work and memory work, goes back to Freud psychoanalysis. So lots of these ideas, I feel, give us a really strong sense of shared and collective memory within the novel amongst those who have these very specific foreshortened lifespans and these experiences. And that's the thing holding them together. So for me, the novel encapsulates the life, our lives in that sense of, uh, um, it can feel intensely short, and all we have are these memories that bind us together in community, which is a very powerful theme in the novel. So that's kind of on the level of the novel, but I feel like on the level of the readership and reading, Ishiguro is very tricky. He plays tricks on us as readers. So you kind of read, believing, initially believing Kathy first person as a first person narrator, and then realizing later, oh, I'm not sure I can fully rely on everything she says because she's euphemistically saying a lot of things, being trained really well by the teachers in Hailsham, but also her own self-deception, also the way she maybe deceives whoever is reading or listening to her telling the tale, as it were. So you then almost have to go back after you've been through the turmoil of being in tears at the end. You have to almost reread again with a different lens, where you're maybe a bit more distant and critical of Kathy, and trying to read beneath the lines of everything that she's saying or that she's deliberately misremembering or whatever it is. And that's at the level of reading. And then you alluded to this, the shared readership over the decades. You have so many people from different generations with, reading it as adults or as teenagers, or those who watched the film and then read the novel. And everyone has their own kind of memories of the characters, and it means different things to them. But they're all bound by this really, many people say bleak. Well, Ishiguro calls it quite an optimistic novel, but this bleak, well, that and situation that that Kathy, Ruth, and Tommy find themselves in, but yet there is some kind of hope in terms of their humanity, if you like, which I think is at the crux of the novel. So you then have the shared memories of the readership, allowing for this novel to continue being something that is classic in the sense that it is timeless, and it links up with a lot of things to do with life, illness, life writing, and the brevity of life all in one, if you like. So certainly the shared memories of readers, and of course when reading again, I realized I've misremembered certain episodes that I was quite certain about, and I realized I was wrong. And that's partly his narrative style. It's quite murky in a way. He because of the lack of detail, it's very easy to confuse. I thought Ruth's memory of the flood was Kathy's, and I had no idea until I read it again, and I was completely wrong. And I feel like this happens to lots of people who reread the novel. Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer to kind
It
of.
was a long question as well. And
I don't know, have I met all those different layers that you talked about?
I
I
think
can't
so,
remember.
yes, thank you. No, interesting you saying you misremembered, but all these details do slip away. Like I remember the boat episode, but I hadn't really remembered the dream. So interesting that that sort of didn't come up for me. I did want to just follow up with a quick point on the question as well, which is it's about their hopes and aspirations. The boat episode is strange because it's sort of tragically modest in terms of what they want to achieve. There's this boat that's not particularly impressive. It's just there and they want to go and see it, um, which I suppose is in some ways typical that their expectations have to be reduced. There's also people talking about, their aspirations in terms of jobs. Yeah, there were a couple of early on, it prompts Miss Lucy's speech. A couple of them are talking about going to America and being actors, but actually Ruth just wants to work in an office. Um, do you think that memory is so important because they're aware that they have less in terms of the future? And with episodes like the boat, do you think that's less about the boat than about actually making memory? Is that what's going on there, or did you have a different read on it?
Um, I think firstly, Ishiguro tends to he uses misdirection a lot in his novels, and I think quite often he likes to use, as you say, kind of the lower ambition of trying to find something that is not something that demands, a huge adventure, almost as signifying something greater, if you like. So yes, I suppose that very modest attempt to see the boat has to be seen in that light. But saying that, I think there have already been organ donations at that point, and not everyone was well. I
Hmm.
think being able to get into a car, sneaking away, getting, being able to do that, and finding this boat, I think realistically, in the world of that story, was probably as much as they could do anyway.
Yeah,
I agree
Ruth
with you.
really
It is about
struggles to get through a fence, as I
exactly,
recall.
yeah.
Help it, yeah.
It felt like going through the trenches just to get to
Hmm.
that point.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is evidence, when you really focus on remembering, in intensely, the details become a bit more alive. And with a foreshortened lifespan, there is no doubt that your memories are more treasured, are more precious, and so you're more awake to the recording of all these different sensory experiences, whether you're seeing the boat, you're feeling it, or and so on. So, I think what you said was absolutely spot on in terms of trying to make memories while you can, and then trying to store them in a way that means something for a particular group of friends is much more meaningful. So I think the that kind of concertining of time definitely affects the way that memories are valued by those who can only live into their early 30s. But also, I think it's also something that says something about the brevity of life in the sense that because we can't always remember everything, and
Yeah.
quite often we misremember. Um, the important thing is actually that subjective experience of being able to have something that you hold on to. Um, I know this is a bit of an academic reference, but I think Anne Whitehead wrote in I think now, writing with care, her research article about Never Let Me Go. She says Never Let Me Go does something really interesting about Ishiguro almost teaching us how we can care in terms of letting go of people, but also holding on to their memories and their lives, I suppose. And that's something that applies in real life when we're caring for people as well, but also applies when we're reading the novel. He isn't, like you say, giving us a lot of detail about how this world works and what's going to happen later. That he can't give us answers to, but there are suggestions in which, we can on our own see things in a different way, change the way we view life. And I think that happens the same with the memories in the novel. You hold it lightly, and if they're not accurate, it doesn't matter because it kind of binds you together. So forgetting is part of remembering anyway. But what matters is the essence that of shared memories that holds that group of friends together and binds them that they will always have, which alludes is alluded to at the very end with Kathy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Anne Whitehead's writing with care, brilliant article, I think. She's my PhD supervisor, so happy to give it a
Oh, I didn't
mention as well.
know.
Um, Lara, your book is Kazuo Ishiguro in Ethics, just been published this year. And just want to focus on one thing that you picked up on. In that scene when Kathy and Tommy, discover the whole background to the organ donation program, Miss Emily comments that they've been kept in the shadows. And you make a very interesting connection between that comment and Plato's famous allegory of the cave, in which, of course, we're stuck in the cave just seeing shadows projected onto the back. Um, so do you think the novel suggests a way in which one whether one is a clone or a normal, could climb out of the cave and escape the world of shadows, which of course was Plato's goal, or is it less optimistic than that?
Yes. Well, I think first of all, I should try and justify a little bit more this idea of Plato's influence. It's something that I caught in interviews, his interest in Plato's philosophy, which alerted me to the importance of perhaps of Plato's allegory of the cave, also in Never Let Me Go. Plato's allegory, of course, is about the limits of our knowledge, but also about the moral obligation we have to keep searching for the truth. And this, I think, is a recurring theme in Ishiguro's fiction, not just in Never Let Me Go. For example, in The Remains of the Day, the butler's narration could be described as a sort of attempt to understand whether he ever really knew his master, Lord Darlington, whether he had completely misunderstood his wisdom and his knowledge of foreign affairs. And in Never Let Me Go, Tommy, for example, is mistaken about the deferrals and about the power of art to reveal his soul and perhaps buy him and Kathy some more time. So Ishiguro's characters often jump to the wrong conclusions, as we do in real life. But Ishiguro thinks that we shouldn't be discouraged, that also in the age of fake news, Plato has an important lesson to teach us. In the Platonic dialogue, Socrates always says that it is very difficult to find the truth, but that we should never give up. We shouldn't start to think that there is no truth and be content just to make up our own, just to fabricate truths. To return to the sentence you cited, which is, you were kept in the shadows. In a purely dystopian reading of the novel, the fact that the clones are kept in the dark about their fate seems to us something terrible and unacceptable, a form of manipulation. But Ishiguro always works on two levels, I think. Never Let Me Go is not just a dystopian metaphor about power, about forms of marginalization, exclusion, or exploitation of minorities or other species that are denied their rights. It is also, I think, a metaphor for our existence, a profound meditation on mortality, as we said. And if we read the novel in this key, the fact that the young clones are told and not told the grim truth about their fate is a way of describing what happens to any child growing up in normal circumstances. I mean, parents and other adults create a kind of bubble around them that makes the world seem more beautiful than it really is, that protects them from the harsher truth of life, from the awareness of evil in the world. So the clones are told and not told, as the guardian Lucy puts it. And Lucy, by the way, comes from the Latin word lux, meaning light, which in Plato stands precisely for truth and goodness. But even Plato is able to appreciate what he calls the noble lie the lie that is told for someone's good, especially a child or a young person. Returning to the myth of the cave, we can add, I think, that many images in Ishiguro's fiction evoke the interplay of light and shadow. This is found also in Clara and the Sun. Sometimes you find scenes in which the characters make a journey from sunlight into a sort of subterranean world of darkness, and they are always metaphorical scenes linked to important revelations, such as when, towards the end of the novel, Kathy and Tommy, as you said, go to Madame's house, and they do so on a sunny day. And the description is that of the front door that has stained colored glass. When Tommy closes it behind him, everything gets very dark, and they see a framed picture of Hailsham hanging on the wall. And this is, of course, somewhat reminiscent of Plato's cave allegory, where the faint images of the reality outside are projected onto the back of the cave. Except that in Never Let Me Go, it is a descent into the shadows of Madame's house that is revelatory rather than the subsequent return to the light outside. And I think this episode recalls also many journeys into the underworld in literary history, such as those of Orpheus or Dante in the Inferno. So descends into shadowy underworlds as journeys of discovery, I think very interesting. And they can be found also in other scenes in Ishiguro's fiction, such as in The Buried Giant, and even in Clara and the Sun. So I think there is a whole range of images. There is a visual world which would be worth exploring. It's one of the things that I will do sometime in the future. Ishiguro, sometimes in Clara and the Sun, for example, it's as if he constructed sort of mythological structure through this imagery of strong contrast between light and darkness. Well, starting from the very title, of course, Clara and the Sun. So yeah, I think the Platonic imagery is very prominent also in Never Let Me Go.
Yeah.
Where there are so many other things that come from play. For example, Guardians. Guardian is the English translation of the guards that are found in the Republic, in Plato's Republic.
And maybe Plato's Republic is a good segue into the final question, because we talked about memory, we talked about philosophy. Let's finish with politics. So one of the biggest issues, maybe the biggest problem people have maybe reacted against, and Yugin alluded to this earlier, is the fact that clones don't rebel, they don't escape, they don't do anything. Okay. And I want to refer to one explanation for this, which I think is very good, is Robert Eagleston's interpretation of the novel, which focuses on the idea of the public secret. And we mentioned complicity before, the idea of the public secret as a form of complicity. We all know, but, we don't sort of openly say this. And it's in that argument, which is actually in a book called The Broken Voice, which is about post-Holocaust fiction. So that gives some indication where he's going. In a very powerful conclusion, he links the clones' detention centers. He links the clones' sort of schools and names like Hailsham to contemporary detention centres in the UK, which have names like Yarl's Wood. And, indeed, the names in the novel are very English, as perhaps is the use of euphemism. So do you think, is Never Let Me Go a specifically English or British novel? What does it say politically about the UK specifically, maybe, or about politics more generally? This is to both of you.
I certainly think it is a very. I mean, there's the English country house tradition that Ishiguro tapped into for The Remains of Day, and I think to some extent he does so with Never Let Me Go, partly because of the school setting, that there are different types of schools. Ours is better than everybody else's. There's that feeling of you are a cut above all the other schools. You need to behave as a Hailsham student should behave. We're not like the other schools. So that's kind of mentioned in different ways. As the novel begins, and you have this sense that you are reminded of that sense of privilege. So I think just from that sense of, and then with a name like Hailsham, I think just with that sense of almost like a private boarding school kind of setting, because of that kind of class system, the allusion to the class system, I find that a very British kind of novel. So on that level, and then at the other level, I think in terms of, obviously there's the secrecy that you're alluding to as well. But for me, it's also about, I think, it is also politics, but I was thinking of, and this always occurred to me with Never Let Me Go, is never seen as a post-colonial text. Generally, it isn't, but there's certainly rumblings there in terms of whether it is euphemistic language or like you mentioned, kind of what Bob Eagleson did with names like Yarl's Wood and then Hailsham, and you had the cottages that are anything but, and so on. So everything has a nice, almost genteel name to it. And with contemporary British life in recent years, you've got a lot of well-known institutions who are being scrutinized for links to the colonial past in terms of artifacts or relics that they have in their collections, or more positive spins on stories of, founders and where they got the money from and so on. I think there is this sense of, a bit like what you're talking about with regards to secrecy or things that are not openly discussed. And I think in terms of that kind of political background, I would say it certainly is very British in terms of links, ideas of colonialism, but also the idea about the class system and kind of privilege and schools. So for me, that's how I see that in terms of politics. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I do agree. I was thinking while you were saying that the clones are a sort of the clones from Hailsham are a sort of aristocracy of the clones, or just like you have great butlers within the larger class of butlers in The Remains of the Day. So yes, this very English idea of class is perhaps interesting to Ishiguro. I don't think not in the sense that it is English in itself, but it can become just like the butler is a metaphor for our relationship to power. This idea of this need we feel to, again, to take sides or to camp or to belong to a group that is more special or greater or more important than others. This is something that is almost an anthropological urge. So he's using this idea, this English idea of class, to say something that is both about Englishness and about humanity as a whole, and about our human instincts. Another thing which is very English, of course, and that you have mentioned, is this idea of understatement, which reminds me, especially, well, not so much in relation to Never Let Me Go as to The Remains of the Day, reminds me a lot of Ford Madox Ford, this idea of keeping up appearances, but at the same time you present certain appearances, but then you realize through this unreliable narrator that there is something rotten at the core. I have a feeling that Ishiguro often uses this dynamics of making you uncertain about what the truth is, if the truth corresponds to the appearances, or and this uncertainty he creates is, I think, a very powerful effect.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for your answers. We covered a lot of ground. I hope we've done the novel justice on its 20th anniversary. We will come back for the third section, in which you're going to give us your recommendations for other reading and predictions. So please, everybody, do join us for part 3. Thank you.